Some of you will know that after serving as a parish minister in Straven, I went on to work as a full-time school chaplain, first in Berkshire, then in Kent, then in Battersea. Alongside my school chaplaincy, I also taught chemistry, with remarkably few explosions and setting off the school fire alarm only twice in 20 years. In addition to chemistry, I also taught religious studies and philosophy to A-level students, so very bright 17 and 18-year-old boys and girls, usually self-proclaimed and self-assured atheists, at least temporarily. One of the modules I taught on the A-level course year in, year out was one of my favorites, and it was called The Nature and Attributes of God, which involved a theological and philosophical critique of the words we use to describe God and the nature of God. Words like omnipotent, which means all-powerful, omniscient, which is all-knowing in space and in time, omnibenevolent, which is all-loving, all-good. Lots of other words too, of course, like eternal, immutable, immaterial, transcendent. The questions were fascinating and challenging. For example, in reference to God's power, can God create a rock so heavy that he cannot lift it? Discuss. 40 marks. Or in reference to God's goodness, is torturing babies wrong because God says it is wrong? Or does God say, do not torture babies because it is wrong anyway? Discuss. 40 marks. These are very profound questions. Several years ago, I remember reading an article that caught my eye. The title was Redefining God. I tell you, I get a little nervous when anyone starts to reimagine or redefine anything, particularly God or the church. Redefining God. An old man, bearded, white beard of course and white skin, or a force in the wind. Restrictive, exclusive male language about God doesn't work for many anymore. Doesn't work for me. Most of us now envision a God who's more accessible, more down here, than the old bearded big man in the sky who has dominated Western Christianity for way too long. When we talk about God, as we sometimes do, and as I certainly do most Sundays, the words we use are important. And the words we use about God have to do with power and authority and patriarchy and omnipotence. Names do matter, of course, because what we call something, how we name it, is to a great extent what it is to us. In the 1st century AD, right at the beginning of the Christian story, images and language about God came from two sources, two distinct and quite different sources. The first was Hebrew religion, Judaism. The second was the philosophy, the culture, the populist religion of the Roman Empire. Jesus was a Jew. He was not a Roman. He certainly read Hebrew, and he spoke Aramaic, which is closely related to Hebrew. All the earliest believers were also Jews. The Jewish religion of Israel, and hence the literature of what we call the Old Testament, had such a high notion of God's mystery and transcendence that there was a law against depicting God in any artistic way. The problem in Judaism with idols, statues, pictures, and trinkets is that they don't ever do justice to their subject, and they result in a diminishment or corruption of the God they attempt to portray. The Jews understood that the same thing happens with language and words. And so God's name is never spoken out loud. And the Old Testament doesn't even attempt to describe God in philosophical or theological terms. Even in English, many Jews will not write the word God using the three letters G, then an O, then a D. Instead, they write G, then a dash or a hyphen, and then a D. The God of Israel is not a statue or an idol or a philosophical concept. The God of Israel is personal. God the Creator, the Liberator, the Judge, the caring presence who will be with us in the valley of the shadow of death, the one who accompanies men and women and children on their life journey wherever they go, even to the uttermost parts of the sea or the depths of hell. Even there, thy right hand shall hold me, to quote Psalm 139. The God of Israel has a heart, cares for people, has compassion. That's a very different way of talking about God or gods, plural, in the ancient Roman world. Quite different. Ancient Roman and Greek gods were unpredictable. They were vain, selfish, cruel. And the purpose of religion was to persuade the gods to give a little protection or health or wealth or success. These gods were frightening. But Israel talked about the goodness and the grace of God, that God was abounding in steadfast love. But that was not the language of everyday society in the sprawling Roman Empire. The main image of a god in that Roman world was raw, unlimited power, defined most eloquently by the Roman emperor himself. His name His name was Octavian. We remember him mainly because he is mentioned in Luke's Christmas story of the birth of Christ. Octavian was the one who united the Roman Empire by sheer brute force after the assassination of Julius Caesar and the suicides of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Octavian was a cunning politician, difficult, delusional, paranoid, and cruel. Those who knew him hated and feared him in equal measure. When he returned to Rome after victorious and bloody battles in Spain and in France, he took a new name, Augustus. Caesar Augustus. Augustus Caesar, which means the high and exalted one. And he erected a statue of himself in the middle of the Roman Forum that was more than 10 times the size of a normal man. And there were many, many other similar statues erected all over the Roman Empire. Augustus was not a normal man. He was really a god to be worshipped, but more importantly, to be feared. And like all those Roman gods, he certainly terrified people, witless. And so as Christianity spread into that ancient Roman world, Christianity used a very different kind of language to talk about God. Our first reading this morning, for instance, the first letter of John, just a few sentences from a letter written to a small Christian community, an emerging church, somewhere in Asia Minor, now part of what we call Turkey. John wrote it near the end of the 1st century AD. Experts guess between 90 and 100. The letter's intended purpose is not theology. Rather, it is addressed to a group of early Christians riven by dispute. A fallout had occurred and boiled over in this particular little church. People were not getting along with one another. And although we don't know what exactly was wrong, it appears they were getting themselves worked up to the point of anger about, you've guessed it, doctrine. The officially authorized belief. Doctrine almost certainly about the nature of Jesus Christ. A topic which we can still launch a fairly heated debate or bust up even today. As I said, the writer of the letter is a man called John. Now, it can't be proven, of course, but there is a rather nice, powerful tradition that the Gospel of John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, that John, and the 3 short letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, tucked away right at the back of the New Testament, the 3 letters which bear his name were written by the same man who wrote the Gospel of John. John, the apostle of Jesus, often called the beloved disciple. He was, tradition has it, the youngest of the 12 disciples, perhaps aged only 19 or 20. So now he's in his 80s, quite old. Perhaps the last of the original 12 disciples still to be alive. And he wants to make sure that this young church in Asia Minor gets it right. There is wisdom in age and experience, or at least there ought to be. So I can imagine old John in his 80s, with his head in his hands, his brow furrowed, late at night, remembering how it was 60 years earlier when he sat beside Jesus and listened to him talk and speak, how he walked with him on the road, how it was on the night Jesus washed their feet. Oh yes, he remembers that night. The night he broke bread and poured the cup. The night he said, I am the vine and you are the branches. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. I can imagine old John, late at night in the sunset of his own life, remembering, and then in an instant of energy and determination and passion and urgency, getting out a scroll and a pen and some ink and scribbling furiously, Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. For God's sake, get a grip. Stop this squabbling for squabbling's sake. Let us love one another, because love is from God. And then, before the ink in his pen ran dry, he continues, whoever does not love God, for God is love. Here is a very critical and radical new theology. God is love. There were and are and will be plenty of other theologies. God is power. God is righteousness. God is judge. God is creator. God is king. God is like me. All of it an attempt to capture the ultimate reality of God in human words or categories or metaphors. And here, an elegantly simple, incredibly powerful new thought. God is love. And the upshot is, the logical conclusion or implication is that since God is love, God lives in us as we love others. That's quite a challenge. The reality that God living in your love, what a radical, provocative thing to say. What a new way to think about God. When you peel back all the layers, at the heart of all things is not a powerful, angry judge, not a vacuum or an empty space. God, John proposes, is love. And you abide in God, and God abides in you, insofar as you allow the love that God is to live in and through you. Old John put it bluntly. Those who say, "Oh, I love God," but hate their brothers and sisters are liars. No ambiguity there, no mincing of words. It's not an abstraction, by the way. It's not love as in emotion, some kind of Platonic concept. It is love expressed in real life and real time. So the love that God is a compassionate, giving, self-sacrificing activity on our part. So a question, a pretty big one. How do you know the reality of God? How do you come to an understanding? Here is the oldest answer of all. God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. So how to add depth to your spiritual life? Integrity and authenticity to your religion? How to feel more in touch with God? The oldest answer of all is not read another book or attend another seminar. The oldest answer of all is start loving. Start showing some of the reality of God by acts of self-giving, sacrificial love. Those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. Christianity as a religion is rooted in the one claim that God is love, and that religion is, in essence, living out that love in the world. And I know that for me, and for every one of us here in Crown Court, or watching at home, there will come a day when everything else is failing, and when we need powerfully and urgently to know that at the center of everything there is a loving heart, that God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. Tomorrow is the anniversary of my ordination. I remember it vividly. The dignity of the officiating ministers, the supporting presence of friends and family, the beauty of the church, the wondrous music. But more than anything, I remember my mother sitting in the front pew with my father and my brother. I could almost feel my mother's loving gaze on the back of my head as I knelt down to be ordained. For her, there was only one person in that church that night, her son, whom she loved, of course. The same mother who, when I was settled in parish ministry in Straven, would drive quite a distance every week after week, on a Thursday, and she would kneel down to clean and scrub the manse. It wasn't my forte. From top to bottom, and stuff the fridge and freezer with food. Not that she's a great cook. Tomorrow, 3rd of May, the anniversary of my ordination, is for me also like a second Mother's Day. Thomas Cahill is an 80-year-old, but sprightly 80-year-old American Catholic writer and historian. I'm very fond of his work. He recalls, as a younger man, how he and some others would volunteer to read bedtime stories to children in Incarnation Children's Center, a foster home for terminally ill children in New York City. When they arrive at the home, they are greeted by the children like pop stars. Thomas Cahill's special child, who he looks after, is Everett. Everett is 4 years old, who cannot speak words any longer, only noises, because his disease has attacked his brain. He cannot walk, has no control of his body from the waist downwards, and Cahill describes one visit. Everett was very sick, actually in the hospital wing, lying listlessly in his cot, a cot with metal bars to prevent Everett falling out. And Cahill writes, "He was so happy to see me. Soon he was pointing sheepishly at his nappy to let me know that he needed to be changed. So I went to find a nurse. I returned to tell Everett he would have to wait a bit. Well, then the wailing began. He threw himself into the pillow and, turning away from me, bawled his heart out. What must it be like to be always at the mercy of others, even for the simplest things?" I put my hand, Cahill writes, through the bars, and my fingers reached his. He did not pull away, and so we stayed like that for a very long time. The tips of my fingers massaging the tips of Everett's, the best I could do, while I said over and over, "It's all right, Everett, the nurse will come." The nurse did arrive. The nappy was changed. Cahill sat down to read the book. And Cahill continues, Everett loved the book a lot. It was a pop-up book, and his little hand emerged between the bars to pull the little tabs that set off the special effects. Towards the end, he lay back, too tired to help with the tabs. When I left him, he was almost asleep, holding the certainly enormous book to his fragile little body. And then Cahill, the brilliant historian, theologian, reflects, and I quote him, "As I returned to the dismal street, there came to me, unbidden, this sentence from John's Gospel. Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother, and his mother's sister, and Mary Magdalene." That was, of course, the very same John who in his old age wrote, "Beloved, let us love one another. God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them."